This is the driest place on Earth. Yet there was once water here. The fretted hills speak of downpour and of deluge. But why are these sun-baked watercourses now so utterly dry? This is the riddle of the Atacama. Stretching down the western side of South America, Chile is an extremely long, narrow country. In the north is the Atacama Desert. It's confined by the Pacific Ocean on one side, and on the other, the mighty Andes Mountains. Here, beside the Atacama, nestled on the roof of the Andes on a great high plain called the Altiplano, there is water, and there is life. Despite the thin, oxygen-starved atmosphere and intense ultraviolet radiation, some animals lead remarkable lives at high altitude. In stark contrast, less than 120 miles from the mountains is the desert's western border, the Pacific Ocean. The sea's riches attract some unlikely hordes. Yet even within sight of this zone of plenty, there exists a completely different world. The sterile Atacama Desert is devoid of movement and of sound. Could any life exist within the desert's arid heart? The spell of silence is broken by air that sweeps down from the Andes. The fierce desert heat spins the cool air skywards. At day's end, when desert colors glow, then dim, the wind finally loses its voice, and there is again utter silence in the Atacama. Then, from the dark wilderness, eerie, unearthly cries can be heard. Nothing was reckoned to live out in the desert. Nothing, except the gulls that were recently discovered here. Each night, some fly more than 60 miles from the sea. Navigating with great precision, they find their partner and chicks. The pair change over quickly. The nesting gull takes off to the ocean, while the homecomer serves supper. This will be the only meal that the chick will receive in 24 hours. Why do these Guruma gulls nest here, so far from food and water, and in the most extreme conditions? After feeding, these remarkable birds quickly cocoon their nestlings against the freezing desert night. Guruma gulls can withstand these cold conditions, but with the return of the new day, they must cope with the opposite problem: extreme heat. As the morning temperature soars, they pant like dogs and fluff their feathers to circulate air close to the skin. nesting birds stand umbrella-like over their eggs. They may withstand the heat, but their unhatched chicks are fragile and vulnerable. A parent will constantly regulate its brooding routine throughout the long day. A Guruma gull's specialization for desert life begins even before it has hatched. Every chick must struggle to escape from an uncommonly thick eggshell. It's designed to prevent water loss in this harsh environment. But the thick shell slows down absorption of oxygen. As a consequence, each chick develops slowly, spending more than 30 days within the egg, the longest of any gull. "7 days after hatching, both parents begin feeding at sea by day, leaving their chick home alone. This is the most perilous time of their lives. Every day for 2 long months, their fragile bodies will be exposed to ground temperatures of more than 60 degrees Celsius. Some make for high places in a desperate attempt to catch any available breeze. Others use whoever or whatever they can as sunshades. Why do Guruma gulls choose such extreme nesting sites? Some say it is a memory of a desert that was once covered by ancient seas and lagoons, and that gulls have never abandoned the nesting places of their ancestors. Others say they nest here for safety. No predator is likely to risk hunting in such a vast and hostile place. The desert is both perilous and protective, and it's only at the very edge that they return to a more reassuring and familiar world. The contrast between desert and ocean could not be greater. Guruma gulls go fishing in one of the richest seas in the world. Their existence in the desert is only possible because this ocean explodes with life. Millions of tons of anchovies and other small fish shoal off the coast of Chile. Inca terns dive vigorously on a shoal of anchovies. They take only 1 or 2 fish and run a rapid shuttle service to waiting youngsters. Unlike the desert dwellers, these chicks receive food on demand from the ocean on their doorstep. These most unusual and resplendent terns perform strict courtship rituals. A male offers an anchovy to a female, both to assure her that he is a good provider and to condition her for breeding. Like brightly attired courtiers in a medieval pageant, they bow appeasingly. And only when due ceremony has been observed is the mating ritual completed. Their neighbours, the pelicans, consume a lot more of the fish. Pelicans can scoop up to 7 pounds of anchovies in their throat pouches. Their colonies form some of the largest concentrations of seabirds along the coast of Chile, and are very crowded, very dirty, and have the overwhelming smell of fish about them. To prevent soiling and infection in a place of filth and parasites, even large chicks lack feathers, looking more like strange prehistoric reptiles. Lunch today and every day is part digested anchovy gruel. Each chick will receive around 220 pounds of fish before it's feathered and old enough to fend for itself. The same feeding frenzy is taking place among 20,000 other pelicans, and of course among all the other seabirds along the coast. So why is the ocean so incredibly rich and able to support so much life? One clue as to why the sea is so bountiful has just arrived in the colony. It's a penguin. And it's not alone. What has brought creatures of snow and ice to the edge of the desert? The answer lies in their name, Humboldt penguins. They're here because of the exceedingly powerful Humboldt current. Flowing all the way from Antarctica, it brings great riches. The current also brings masses of cool water. It rarely gets above 12 degrees Celsius. Sea lions, like penguins, can swim in the cold water whenever they overheat. Curious juveniles perform their languid ballet in water of surprisingly low visibility. The water is cloudy because of the incredible growth of plankton. Up to 4,000 microscopic organisms in every pint. Conditions are ideal for plankton growth. It's stimulated by oxygen-rich water, upwelling minerals, and the intense sunshine. This incredibly rich broth at the bottom of the food chain eventually feeds everything along the desert coast. But the cold Humboldt current alters conditions above the waves as well. The air above the colony is 10 to 15 degrees cooler than expected at this latitude. Cooler air does make life a little more bearable in the sea lion colonies. Fur coats and layers of blubber are not recommended desert wear. But if the air is not cool enough, then there's always the luxury and relief of the Humboldt current. And it's out over the cool ocean that one part of the riddle of the Atacama can be solved. At these latitudes, there exist permanent high-pressure zones generated by dry tropical air. They prevent any clouds bearing rain from reaching the land. However, the air above the Humboldt Current offers some relief. Every day, as the land heats up, clouds are drawn tantalizingly in from the ocean, where fog forms. The fog billows and swells, obscuring the sun. In northern Chile, this fog bank is known as the Camanchaca. But the Camanchaca is not a totally empty gesture. Along the hilltop closest to the sea is a unique community of plants and animals. All live on the very edge of life. They can only exist here because of the water vapor provided by these daily fogs. Moisture may condense on lichens or the spines of cacti. Ridged stems then funnel water down to the roots. The Camanchaca brings the miracle of life to the desert fringe, but it's a cruel and empty gesture to the parched land beyond. A few hundred yards from the coast, the fog evaporates into thin air. These large South American camels, guanacos, aren't confined to this coastal fringe of life, but some of the plants they feed on are. Guanacos survive on this tough plant material. For water, they will suck lichens like a sponge. The cacti that survive with least water are barrel cacti. On the extreme edge are those that bury half their barrels into the earth to help reduce moisture loss, and they also religiously face the noonday sun to minimize the area exposed to its harsh rays. They mark the edge of the desert, the edge of life. The desert extends southward for more than 600 miles. Always there is a coastal fringe of life. Closer to its southern boundary, a little winter rain assists the fog in growing larger cacti and allows larger animals to gain a greater foothold. The main food of the black-chested buzzard eagle are degus, small rodents of the desert edge. Degus control buzzard eagles' survival through their breeding abilities. In most years, degus can breed to very high numbers because they're superbly adapted for life on the edge of aridity. They don't drink water, as there is none. Each animal takes its entire water needs from the plants it eats. And as these plants are very tough and dry, so the degus' needs are very small indeed. To prevent overheating and water loss, they emerge in the cool of the morning and again in the early evening to feed close to their burrows. The buzzard eagle has a large feeding range. It must spend most of its time hunting, It is no longer just feeding itself. Back at the nest, there are two more. One chick is clearly stronger than the other, but there is a harsh survival logic in its aggression. In years of little food, the bigger, stronger chick will take all and grow well. The weaker will eventually die through stress and neglect. The alternative is for both to weaken and possibly die. The eagle parent returning with food does not play favorites. It dismembers another hapless daegu. It feeds the nearest begging mouth, which always belongs to the stronger chick. The fortunes of predators may be linked to their prey, but ultimately everything depends on the daily fogs of the common chukar. This desert fringe has a surprising variety of animals. Each must find its own ways of dealing with extremes. Pinguera, the giant hummingbird, must take frequent rests while feeding. It lacks the sustained hovering ability of smaller hummingbirds. It now returns to work on its partially completed nest. It binds the soft material by smearing it with a sticky saliva. Hummingbirds require a constant and plentiful supply of high-energy nectar. If few flowers bloom on the edge of the desert, their ability to successfully breed is at risk. But avoiding peril can itself be perilous. A coffee moth caterpillar's stinging spines may not protect it from Chile's largest lizard. The Calopistes iguana neutralizes the stings by wiping the caterpillar clean. The job must be thorough, so the iguana continues in the shade to avoid overheating. But in the constant balancing act of hunger versus risk, some food remains permanently off the menu. The poisoned hairs on the Chilean tarantula can become embedded in the mouths of desert animals. They know to leave it well alone. Pinguera stays out in the midday sun. She's hunting insects on the wing. Her young chicks now require protein if they're to survive, but feeding them is an art in itself. It combines the delivery rate of a petrol pump with the aim of a sword swallower. Near the southern edge of the desert, where coastal hills are a little higher, the Daily Camanchaca creates its ultimate gift, its greatest contrast to the desert. Here, incredibly, a rainforest looms out of the fog. The high hills catch just enough fog to grow a few tiny forests, which are known internationally as great wonders of the botanical world. trees and shrubs capture 6 times more moisture than the lower slope nearby. Branches are draped with epiphytes and mosses, and the air is filled with the pungent aroma of humus. It's unbelievable that just a few hundred yards to the east, the driest desert in the world awaits. In the millions of years since rain filled the watercourses of the Atacama Desert, this wilderness has proved a highly effective barrier to the movement of wildlife. For many thousands of years, however, one species has repeatedly crossed the desert and left clear evidence of its passing. These huge geoglyphs were probably ancient signposts. But what else do these complex and mystifying patterns show? And who were the people who made them? Closer to the mountains, in valleys where a little water brings a splash of green, there are caves. In them lie the remains of peoples thousands of years old. The dry desert air has also preserved their art which speaks of their enduring bonds with the desert and with the mountains to the east. Candelabra cacti stand as sentries. Beyond them, mountains rise to the Altiplano, the high plain. This is the home of the descendants of those mummified desert people. Every morning, an Aymara herdsman greets his gods. The objects of his worship are the 20,000-foot peaks of the Andes, the western edge of the Atacama Desert, and the mightiest mountain barrier in the world. The mountains are flanked by scores of active volcanoes, ominous and potent indicators of mountains in the making. Geysers billow furiously in the coldness of early morning. They are born of intensely hot rocks close to the surface. Far below, continental plates collide, forcing these young mountains ever skyward. And just as the cold Pacific Ocean answers one half of the riddle of the Atacama, so the Andes answers the other half. Rain-bearing clouds from the tropical northeast are prevented by these mountains from ever reaching the desert below, the high peaks forcing the clouds to release all their precious moisture. Melted snow and rain then flow into the highest lakes in the world, some more than 12,000 feet above the sea. Here, life faces enormous extremes of ultraviolet radiation, of cold, and of thin, oxygen-starved air. Yet animals cope. The giant coot's large size probably helps them withstand the harsh climate. Whenever lakes are ice-free, the birds will gather large quantities of weed to construct huge volcano-shaped nests. But giant coots have yet another all-consuming passion. Family groups are forever disputing territory. If one group crosses some invisible line in the lake, their neighbours will rush out and beat them up. Neither group ever wins the war. The only concession is an uneasy truce. Until next time. From the high lakes flow rivers and streams which create precious ribbons of green, known as bofedals. For centuries, they've been lifelines for the Aymara and their flocks of llamas and alpacas. These South American camels have ensured the survival of communities in the Andes. Llamas are beasts of burden. The shorter alpacas are bred for their fine hair. Life above 12,000 feet has demanded adaptations of both the animals and the people who tend them. The blood of both contains high numbers of red cells to extract maximum life-giving oxygen from very thin air. A wild type of camel also lives up on the Altiplano. The hair of the vicuña is the finest natural fibre in the world. It was more highly valued than gold, and the desire to possess it very nearly led to their extinction. Their numbers continue to recover. It's breeding season. A male drives off the bachelors that have come too close to his harem. Vicuña rarely pause during these high-speed chases, which may go on for hours. With little oxygen to sustain them, their stamina is extraordinary. The territory holder concentrates his attacks on the leader of the group. The tactic works. The bachelors lose their resolve and drift down the valley, away from his territory. The plants are extremely tough and spiky, with little food value. Yet these remarkable animals not only survive, they're coming back from the edge of extinction. A fox is attracted to the birth of a vicuña. Vicuña births always take place in the early morning. The infant dries off and gathers its strength in the day's sunshine. However, with the mother in attendance, there is no chance here of a meal for a hungry fox. But as the supreme opportunist, the fox will take advantage of any food source. These qualities have enabled it to prosper in all of Chile's extremes. The Bofedal is strewn with piles of rock, the remains of old volcanic eruptions. They're much sought after by vizcachas. These unusual animals warm themselves after another freezing night on the Altiplano. Though vizcachas look and behave like rabbits, they're only distant relatives. They're far more closely related to the Andean big-eared mice, with whom they share the rough grass and the dangers of the Bofedal. Viscachas and mice, by feeding side by side, provide each other with a survival strategy, an early warning system. At the approach of the fox, the sentry's whistle alerts the viscachas. But a few mice fail to heed the warning. Rivers and streams continue their winding journeys through a maze of hills towards the desert. Most will never make it. They end in large basins. Here, water evaporates rapidly, leaving vast salt pans, stretching as far as the eye can see. There are signs of life in this desert of salt. A pink stain from a washed-up tide of algae and bacteria feeds tiny brine animals. They, in turn, feed some highly specialized birds. Flamingos gave rise to the legend of the phoenix, a bird said to live for 500 years, then built its own funeral pyre from which it rose reborn and unscathed by flames. Though their feathers are still tinged with those legendary fires, the red colour comes from a carotene pigment in the brine creatures on which they dine. 3 species inhabit the salt lakes. Both the James and Andean flamingos strain the water for the tiniest microorganisms, whereas the Chilean flamingo feeds according to its Spanish name, Flamenco chileno. The flamenco dance stirs the mud to release brine shrimps and fly larvae. Other birds perform ballets of the brine lake. Wilson's phalaropes come all the way from North America to feed at these salt lakes in the desert. Others live nearby all year round, like Andean geese. But whatever the bird, and by whatever means, scythe, sieve or spear, they all reap the harvest of the salt lake. Flamingos build nests in large colonies on the salt pan, but each species keeps to its own area, and each pair to its own mud stack nest. Young chicks are unable to feed themselves. Instead, their parents feed them a blood-red secretion similar in composition to mammalian milk. Flamingos are highly adapted for life on the salt pan. Not only must they cope with extreme heat, but also with the highly caustic salt. As chicks grow older, they gather in large groups for mutual protection. They're easily startled. A gust of wind is enough to send them into a stampede. These flamingos are true survival specialists. They overcome the heat of the driest desert in the world, where the rules of life are brutally simple. Adapt or die. The skeleton of a mule, one that was given its freedom in the desert. Without food or water, it perished, its flesh baked to powder by sun and wind. The mule was one of many working animals released when the nitrate industry here collapsed earlier this century. At its peak, 45,000 workers at 170 sites mined huge deposits of nitrate salts, laid down millions of years ago when the desert lay beneath the sea. Fortunes were made, just as easily as lives were lost. And although the nitrate industry went bust, another boomed. The largest man-made hole in the world at Chuquicamata has been created in the search for copper. Up to 2% of the rock is pure copper. This is the desert's buried treasure. Copper remains the biggest contributor to the Chilean economy. Ore is taken out of the ground at the rate of 500,000 tons a day. And pure copper rolls out of the desert on huge, never-ending wagon trains. Technology and profit keep people in the Atacama. Should either fail, then they will leave. Bulk carriers wait like ghosts in the fogs of the Camanchaca. Of all of northern Chile, it is the sea that is the least extreme place to live. The cool and powerful Humboldt Current brings riches beyond belief from distant Antarctic oceans. These riches attract a great variety of predatory fish and marine mammals to the edge of the desert. But they're not the only hunters of the deep. On one hand, factory ships take 2 million tons of anchovies from this coast each year. On the other, a solitary diver on the end of a breathing pipe gathers what he can. Such is the bounty that even he may gather more than 100 species of fish and shellfish. One of the most highly prized delicacies is the loco, an abalone-like shellfish. The riches to be had in the kelp beds and rocky bays along Chile's desert coast sustain more than 30 towns and villages. This is not commercial harvesting of the sea by factory ships, but small-scale fishing to feed local families. In this way, the needs of the people are no different to that of pelicans or sea lions or penguins. All rely on the bounty of the sea, but that great bounty is balanced on a knife edge. The riddle of the Atacama is explained by a weather machine out beyond the coast. But the weather can sometimes give a twist to that riddle. All creatures that make a home along the coast of Chile live on a border of extreme contrasts. On one side of the shore, there is immense richness. On the other, there is only poverty and sterility. But in some years, the parched desert has its revenge, and the sea becomes as barren as the desert. In the years of El Niño, a reversal of weather patterns and ocean currents transforms the sea. It is warm, clear, and there is little plankton. Without plankton, there are no anchovies, and without anchovies, the birds disperse or die. The good years are so good for the Humboldt penguins that they breed twice. This is also a good insurance policy against hard times. Each day they come ashore late in the afternoon when the sun's heat is less fierce. But once ashore, they face the problem of life on a bountiful and popular beach. To reach their nests, they must thread an uncertain path through a colony of tetchy sea lions. Mission accomplished. But now come the energetic rituals of greeting one's family. This frenzy of calling, preening and courting comes at the end of a day when a penguin may have had to swim 30 miles to fill its belly with fish, a very long way for a small bird. But in bad years they may swim 2 or even 3 times that distance and still come home hungrier than when they left. But on the whole, Humboldt penguins have made successful, if rather hectic, lives for themselves, next to the ocean current of the same name. For penguins, the benefits of good years always outweigh the risks and disasters of bad ones. But further along the shore, there are birds for whom every year involves huge risk. Guruma gulls live constantly balanced on the edge of survival. Some have chicks waiting in the desert. Others are still courting and mating. Finally, in the late afternoon, they take off on their long journey. In order to conserve energy, the Guruma gulls ride thermals. This enables them to spiral to great height before striking out on their epic flight into the desert. They alone choose to raise their young in the middle of the driest place on Earth. Whether they do it to escape the clutch of predators or in memory of the shores of ancient seas may be another riddle. But their endurance here is truly heroic. This is the driest place on Earth. Yet there was once water here. The fretted hills speak of downpour and of deluge. But why are these sun-baked watercourses now so utterly dry? This is the riddle of the Atacama. Stretching down the western side of South America, Chile is an extremely long, narrow country. In the north is the Atacama Desert. It's confined by the Pacific Ocean on one side, and on the other, the mighty Andes Mountains. Here, beside the Atacama, nestled on the roof of the Andes on a great high plain called the Altiplano, there is water. And there is life was reckoned to live out in the desert. Nothing, except the gulls that were recently discovered here. Each night, some fly more than 60 miles from the sea. Navigating with great precision, they find their partner and chicks. The pair change over quickly. The nesting gull takes off to the ocean, while the homecomer serves supper. This will be the only meal that the chick will receive in 24 hours. Why do these Guruma gulls nest here, so far from food and water, and in the most extreme conditions? After feeding, these remarkable birds quickly cocoon their nestlings against the freezing desert night. Despite the thin, oxygen-starved atmosphere and intense ultraviolet radiation, some animals lead remarkable lives at high altitude. In stark contrast, less than 120 miles from the mountains is the desert's western border, the Pacific Ocean. The sea's riches attract some unlikely hordes. Yet even within sight of this zone of plenty, there exists a completely different world. The sterile Atacama Desert is devoid of movement and of sound. Could any life exist within the desert's arid heart? The spell of silence is broken by air that sweeps down from the Andes. The fierce desert heat spins the cool air skywards. At day's end, when desert colors glow, then dim, the wind finally loses its voice, and there is again utter silence in the Atacama. Then, from the dark wilderness, eerie, unearthly cries can be heard. Nothing. Garuma gulls can withstand these cold conditions, but with the return of the new day, they must cope with the opposite problem: extreme heat. As the morning temperature soars, they pant like dogs and fluff their feathers to circulate air close to the skin. Nesting birds stand umbrella-like over their eggs. They may withstand the heat, but their unhatched chicks are fragile and vulnerable. A parent will constantly regulate its brooding routine throughout the long day.